Well, the most important thing, and like the key takeaway to this entire podcast episode, is about load management. Load management is key, just period. It's key in the prevention of injury. It's key for progression towards any goal, and it's massively important when it comes to coming back to training. We are on episode 36, and I think today, in my opinion, is the most important podcast episode that I've done, because it's the most common thing I think that we are all going to have to deal with, which is learning to train around injury. Like I said, super important, because if you like working out, you like pushing your body, and you enjoy training hard, then at some point in time, you're probably going to have a niggle or two to work around. And what we don't want is, the second there's a slight niggle, to have everyone just stop working out completely. All the set statements around what happens, lose all your gains, and there's frustrations of progress stalling and everyone sort of going back to square one. So we want to keep people training, and let's discuss how to do that. So first up, let's normalize injuries. It is part of life, sport, movement as a whole. I see all these sort of like bulletproof your knees and such as person's method or blueprint, usually around how they're going to completely safeguard you from injury and mitigate at all cost any chance of getting injuries. It's a cute notion, but it's utter nonsense. There is no way to train to safeguard yourself from every single type of injury or type of force that's going to come at your body from the sort of wonderfully chaotic world that we live in, stepping off or slipping off a curb, or quickly having to kind of like cut and move. Yeah, some things are trainable, but it's unlikely at all time you're going to have all the tolerance to force that is needed. That being said, if you're constantly sort of like bending over to pick up a sock and blowing your back out every time, then that's a major issue, and that needs to be, or your approach to exercise as a whole needs to be looked at. But that is definitely for a whole separate podcast. So first up, let's talk about injuries and resting. In that initial phase, straight after injury, so 24, 48 hours, directly after you've twisted your ankle, you've done something, in that acute stage is where swelling and inflammation is at its highest. Then yeah, you do want to rest and not put any load or force through the joint. Outside of the first 72 hours, 3 days, you're probably going to want to start to reinstate some sort of movement to it to improve blood flow and to improve or restore the range of motion. So some light mobility work, so gentle stretching, controlled movement, really to gauge where you're at, gauge what's restricted, also to see what your pain threshold is like. If you're doing movements and it's a 7 out of 10 or higher, then you're going to need to go and see a physio if that's not massively backed off after 3 days. But what I would say is, my parents' generation, when there's any kind of pain, it's like, just stop and rest because you might hurt yourself further. That's super old school. Outside of being told that by a specialist, I would suggest to promote light movement, controlled movement to gauge where you really are at and where your restrictions really are. So outside of those 3 days, like, what can we do? So we've started to incorporate some light mobility. Now maybe we want to start thinking about doing some sort of training as a whole to maintain the momentum of your training. So there's generally something you can do. So for example, if you've sprained a lower limb, joint, ankle or something, obviously you can train upper body. If you've damaged the shoulder, obviously you can train the lower body. And then thinking about it, even if I had sprained my ankle really badly, okay, I can't do squats necessarily and put load through that foot. And I probably won't be able to do hinges either because it loads the foot. But I could do some open chain exercises where your feet aren't on the ground, leg curl, leg extension, just avoiding that ground pressure. I might even be able to do like a back extension machine. Probably could do things like a reverse hyperextension. You could definitely do. Getting into the gym, obviously it really helps in this scenario when we're talking about strength training and the gym, but getting into the gym and just sort of like seeing what you can do avoiding obviously putting a lot of pressure into the joint overall. And then if it's like upper body, of course, if you've damaged the elbow or the shoulder, then of course you can train the lower limbs. And if you are looking at training the upper body, then you're going to need to think about like training around that. And that kind of leads to the next point. Like the principles of training around an injury is really important. So I already mentioned like you can modify the exercise. So I mentioned doing a open chain exercise. So open chain exercise is where you haven't got a pressure, still loading a joint. So in the context of the ankle injury, I can load the hip, I can load the knee, but I'm not putting pressure directly into the joint itself. But I also might want to, after a week or two, when the pain starts to subside, start to put some load through the joint. I might want to start to stand and do some sort of squat or hinge. What can I do then? Well, the most important thing, and like the key takeaway to this entire podcast episode, is about load management. Load management is key, just period. It's key in the prevention of injury. It's key for progression towards any goal, and it's massively important when it comes to coming back to training. So load management is like it sounds, like scaling back your load or volume significantly and then progressing back up systematically. So you're not just going straight in on a hard weight that you used to be doing on an RDL or a squat, that you're obviously scaling back. And I wouldn't expect someone to want to go in at their top weight. Well, I'd hope someone wouldn't try and do that. Other good things to think about is adjusting your range of motion. So just thinking about a movement of the shoulder girdle or a movement to the ankle. Of course, you might notice that particular parts of the range might be painful. So for example, if I've got tennis elbow, I might find that locking out the joint is problematic. Or when I'm coming to that very, very end range of elbow being bent, that's also problematic. But I could stay in my pain-free ranges and effectively just explore the movement as a whole to try and find a part of the movement that I can train in as little pain as possible. A little bit of pain isn't a huge issue. I think sometimes people are very, very fearful of taking a joint into any kind of pain. It really is that sort of scale, thinking about not going past a 7 out of 10, or certainly not in the context of under load, but like a 6 out of 10. But just sort of feeling what your body can tolerate is a really great thing to kind of think about. Also, with the example of something like tennis elbow, sometimes things like palms facing down and pushing or pulling, or palms facing up, pushing and pulling, may be really like good information to feel when you're in the gym. Generally speaking, like palms facing each other, like what we call neutral, is a nicer position for the elbow to go through. But when you're in the gym, you can sort of explore that and see what position just feels a bit more problematic, and then position the elbows or position the hands into a set loading that feels the most comfortable overall. One of the things you need to be aware of course, is that not all pain is going to be noticed right there and then in the gym. So you don't want to be right up on your certainly on your first going back into the gym. You don't want to be right up on the threshold of what you can tolerate from pain on first exposure to the load. You want to make it super, super easy. Back to that conversation about load management. So the first workout feels like it was really, really kind of like too little, and then just see how you feel the next day, because part of that feedback loop isn't just right there and then, it is also how does it feel the next time, so the next day or 24 48 hours later, rather than just always using the pain you experienced during the workout overall to manage it. I think it's important when it comes to conversations around programming considerations. Because let's say you've got your workout, your 3 days, full body workouts written, and you know you're loading on these exercises, you know how many reps performed you can do, and I'm now telling you to back off on certain loads. Well, that's going to feel quite disheartening, certainly on the joints you're working through that you know you're feeling pain. Potentially, it's better to swap out completely and come with a fresh new program based on the first couple of sessions to see what you can manage in the gym, because the psychology around feeling like you backed right off can be quite frustrating. And that's the next point. Psychology and injury mindset is key, because injuries suck. Let's face it, like everyone that's ever got injured, certainly if you're the sort of person who loves training, you like pushing yourself hard, or you're just getting into a really nice routine and rhythm with it, injuries aren't great. So then thinking, oh, last week I could do this, or last month I could do this, and now I can only lift X amount, that can feel quite disheartening. So potentially you have to sort of like lean into your own psychology. If you know that's going to like affect you, it massively affects me. I would definitely change my exercises, come in with a different set of exercises that I don't necessarily have immediate memory of what I could manage with it. So when I'm rehabbing back up, it doesn't feel quite as backed off overall. Because yeah, I mean, no one really like loves rehab. It's not the same as a hard, intense workout. And if you're sort of geared up towards hard workouts, then potentially you want to end up pushing the exercises that you know you were working harder a bit too soon. And we need to sort of be mindful of that. So taking the exercise out can just help you not feel like you're trying to push too hard too soon. That being said, again, go back to this like idea of there's always a body part you can train. Like if I hurt my shoulder, I can still push hard on leg press. If I've hurt my ankle, I can still push hard on shoulder press. I get it, like spinal injuries, hip injuries, because of the way that load refers through the body, and the spine needs to, or the trunk muscles need to brace to stabilize. Spinal injuries and lower back injuries can be a little bit more problematic. If I'm doing like a chest press, I'm probably still going to need to brace against it, but I can still get a good workout if I move from like a barbell bench press to like a seated chest press machine where I'm nice and stationary. I might need to up my reps and decrease my load, so I'm doing more of a high volume set, but I can still get a good feeling like I'm working hard, because that lower load under higher reps, I can still get very fatigued doing that in a good way. I can still push hard and feel like I'm getting a lot of high effort, but because the load isn't so large, I don't need to brace and stabilize my spine. So if I had a lower back injury, I can still get a good workout, or the sense of a good workout. And the psychology there is really important. Like, understand that as long as I get that feeling like I can push something hard, whereas other on the areas that aren't affected, whereas the areas that are affected, then it's a different mindset towards what I'm going to do with those. That's going to be much more the recovery process, and not trying to sort of rush back. Because the next point is, obviously we do want to try and avoid re-injury. Again, going back to what I said at the start, we can't completely bulletproof ourselves from injury, and the most common injury is a recurrence of either an old injury or your last injury. So that kind of like checking your ego is super important. Just because pain has subsided, let's say for 2 weeks, doesn't mean you're back to full capacity. And think of it like this: if you did something, and I don't know, you like, let's go back to the stepping off an icy curb, and you twist your ankle. Let's just say you're not feeling pain anymore. Well, the injury meant that the angle in which you came down on that ankle and the force in which you put through that ankle was greater than what you could tolerate last time. So yeah, okay, you're not back to being in pain, but you're not going to have anywhere near the force management capabilities of where you were at even pre-injury, pre-slipping off that curb. So you want to get that joint back to the amount of force that it can tolerate. So you need to be gradually rebuilding those specific joints, because just because you're pain-free for a week or two doesn't mean you're out the woods. Doesn't mean like, yeah, I can just go back to lifting and training and playing sports as I was before. You want to go back and gradually rebuild that strength and strengthen the injured joints and integrate like structured prehab into your long-term programming. I always think when I talk to new clients, one of the things I always want to get is a really detailed understanding of their injury history, and effectively keep things in the workout that are going to help mitigate. Like I said, I'm not going to sit here and say that I can bulletproof that person from never having an injury again. But if I've got a client who's come to me and they've got a recurrence of lower back issues and a recurrence of shoulder issues, I'm going to make sure we keep lower back strengthening, core strengthening, shoulder stability, end range shoulder strength exercises in their workout at just like a baseline level, to make sure I take care of the joint, the mobility of the joint, the stability of the joint, and the loading and the controlling of it overall. And again, that kind of like keeping ego in check is important, just to generally talk about the load management again. Like I said, load management is just important, period. But when we're coming back to loading a joint that has been problematic, just because you can load a joint back to where you were like 4 or 5 weeks ago doesn't mean you necessarily should, because generally as well, when it comes to injuries, especially if it's like a joint-based injury, we know that muscles and the cardiovascular system, they adapt pretty quickly. Lots of blood flow, lots of oxygen, lots of nutrients. The second you damage a tendon, second you damage the ligament, blood flow isn't as high, so therefore nutrient delivery and recovery timeframes take longer. So we want to respect that you can't always feel everything that's going on in your body. So making sure that we do, as I said, integrate some kind of prehab to make sure those muscles are and surrounding tissues, tendons, ligaments, etc., are being strengthened long term. And we are just being conscious around the returning back to strength overall. But again, going back into psychology, what we don't want to have is an injured mindset for too long. You don't want to feel like you're delicate and feeling like you're broken and you can't push yourself. But on the other side, you don't want to go gun ho. There is a sweet spot to be found, and knowing your own psychology, knowing where potentially you might go into it a bit too hard, or potentially you'll be so worried about hurting yourself again that you won't go hard enough. That's actually really good insight to sort of think about how are you going to approach this going forward. So final takeaway, really, like I've touched on 2 or 3 times, bulletproofing your body is a myth. Anyone claiming that is just selling some sort of marketing program gimmick at you. Yes, of course, you can do good work to strengthen joints, but you can't bulletproof yourself completely. You can train smart, you can progress your loading, and you can manage the setbacks of injury and come back, but maybe stronger physically, but also with a better psychology around injury management as a whole. If I think about some of the clients I've worked with long-term, that maybe had a couple of injuries, one of the things I both pride myself on and really enjoy chatting to clients about is psychologically, the second injury wasn't as bad as the first injury, and the third not as bad as the second, because they get more used to what happens in the scenario where they get a slight niggle. So understanding the body, understanding the sort of the protocol. You haven't got to know every single injury protocol, but you have to understand that need to back off and then come back at it, try and restore movement and load through it. So it's always really nice when people are getting kind of just more used to managing it. So of course, injuries shouldn't happen too frequently. But when they do, not having this big stop and this big psychological worry and stress and panic, and actually much more of a rational, well, okay, this is just part of the process. I've been through this process before. Maybe it's a different joint, but I can understand what I did last time and how I could implement that into a new injury. That really is key, because we want to keep people training forever. Longevity is super important. We want to build resilience overall, but we also want to make sure we don't try and pretend that injuries are not going to be something that we have to be thinking about or potentially just aware of, if you like training and training hard. And if you need help coming back from injury and reinstating strength and rehab into your own training to get back stronger than ever before, then I am available for online training.